If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them through the question box, and then there'll be a time at the end of the presentation where the speakers will be answering the questions. If you have any logistical questions as well in terms of difficulties hearing audio or anything like that, you can submit them in the question box or through the chat, and we'll be sure to address those. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Rebecca Morley to kick us off.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone today. Today's conversation is about new preemption, a look at state efforts to limit local power in policymaking with a special focus on housing. Over the last decade, state legislatures across the nation have been passing more laws forbidding or preempting local control over a large and growing set of public health, economic, environmental, and social justice policy solutions. This increased state interference in local decision-making has chilled local initiative and regulation. So the purpose of today is to talk a little bit about the scope and effects of this new preemption across several policy realms with a special focus on housing, as I mentioned. And we're fortunate to be joined today by Kim Haddow, who is the director of the Local Solutions Support Center. It's a national hub that coordinates and creates opportunities to counter the misuse of preemption and strengthen local democracy. For the past 2 decades, as president of Haddow Communications, Haddow has worked with a broad range of nonprofit orgs on messaging and branding, strategic campaign planning, and opposition management. She also worked at Greer Margolis Mitchell & Burns, a Washington, D.C. based media consulting firm, advising political initiative, cause-related marketing, and nonprofit campaigns. She began her career at WWL AM Radio. We also have Nestor Davidson joining us today. He joined the faculty of Fordham Law School in 2011 and was named the Albert A. Walsh Chair in Real Estate, Land Use, and Property Law in 2017. He's an expert in local government law, property law, affordable housing law, and policy, and serves on as the faculty director of the law school's Urban Law Center. He also previously practiced with the firm of Latham & Watkins, focusing on commercial real estate and affordable housing. And we apparently shared some time at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Nestor was a special counsel and principal deputy counsel at HUD in both the Clinton and Obama administration. So with that, I am going to hand off to Kim and Nestor to tell us a little bit more about preemption. And we will welcome your questions at the end of their slides, and look forward to the dialogue today. Thanks so much. Kim? You may be on mute, Kim. Nestor, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
I'm back on. Okay.
Hopefully.
I'm back on.
Thank you.
There she is. We got her. Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So where are we? Ready to start?
Right there.
Okay.
First slide. Yep. Thank you.
So sorry about that. So I think many of you are familiar with preemption. It is a tool that has been used for a long time. It is an idea where one level of government can forbid or limit another level of government from enacting or enforcing legislation or policy. In this case, we are talking particularly about the use of state preemption. And traditionally, it's been used, I think folks understand, to either make sure that there is compliance between and no contradiction between state and local law, and also to make sure that there is, to set a floor, a minimum standard that localities can then enhance, build on, strengthen. So setting a minimum standard where localities are allowed to build on what a state has done. Next slide. So many of you are familiar. I pulled this up. This is the new CDC map as of June this year, looking at 3 forms of preemption on tobacco advertising, licensure, and smoke-free indoor air and youth access. So this is, what the preemption map on these tobacco-related issues look like right now. So tobacco and guns began the whole preemption, the use of state preemption as a strategy to keep local governments from regulating. Next. But what we're dealing with now is something quite different. So it is not, what we have seen traditionally in terms, again, of syncing up city and state laws. It is not also floor preemption, which enables cities to localize and strengthen laws that have been passed at the state. This is very deliberately, over the last decade, an effort to extensively, intentionally, and sometimes punitively keep localities from addressing a host of problems. Often we see it propelled by trade associations, and frankly, sometimes what we do see is an effort to end regulation at every level. So it is not just that they are going to preempt the city from, or county from passing a regulation, but it is also with the intention of the state not acting at all. So there is a vacuum, and that there is no policy remedy that then is available in the state, because the state has no intention to act and the cities are prohibited from acting. Next. So what we see is a huge increase, and this has been since basically 2010, in the quantity of preemption law. So we now have half the states where local government cannot raise the minimum wage, 23 states where they cannot act on or regulate local paid sick days, 33 states, which Nestor is going to go into more deeply, where equitable housing policies are prohibited, 44 states that have local gun prohibitions on local gun regulations. And you see it across a broad, again, plastic bags, soda taxes, e-cigarette regulation. It really is a huge number of preemption laws that we have seen at the state level in the last 9 years. Next. The other thing about this level of state interference in local lawmaker and local regulatory setting is it's also across many more policy issues than we've ever seen. I mean, we have seen preemption before, again, around, local taxing and budgetary authority. But we are seeing it now in the areas of local zoning, civil rights, particularly when it comes to LGBTQ non-discrimination ordinances, broadband we've seen over the last 10 years, but also now going into 5G and new technologies, and then public health and safety, housing, labor standards. Again, so more laws across more policy realms is what we've seen in the last 9 years. Next. The other thing we're seeing is preemption used in ways it was never used before 2011, which is to overturn the outcomes of voter ballot initiatives. So in all of these cities, plus there's another I need to add, in all of these cities, voters went to the polls, approved a ballot measure, which was then overturned by the legislature in its next session. So whether it was a fracking ban or a local hire law or paid sick days or in Fayetteville, non-discrimination ordinances, these are all things voters said we're fine with, and the state came in and said, no, we're not fine with. Next. The other thing is that I think if you had a chance to look at that broad swath of laws that we're seeing a lot of preemption activity around, many of these are policies that have been used traditionally to help lift folks out of poverty, that disproportionately affect low-wage workers, people of color, and women. So we're looking at a lot of preemption around wage bills, paid sick time bills, salary history, ban the box, predictive scheduling. I mean, you think of the folks who need the help from that kind of policy, those are the folks who are most directly affected by the loss of the ability of localities to pass that kind of policy. Next. So the other thing we've seen in terms of characteristics of this, what we call the new preemption, it does include punitive aspects. They come in two forms. One of them is if a city, particularly around sanctuary cities or gun laws, passes a measure that the state disagrees with, the state will cut off funding. And we're looking at state revenue sharing funds. We're looking at grants. We're looking at cities losing their place in infrastructure priority lists. So there is that punitive aspect. And then there is also the punitive aspect where individual elected officials are targeted, either by fining, firing, civil right of action, where local mayors, for example, like Mayor Gillum in Tallahassee, was sued because of the refusal of Tallahassee to get rid of a gun law that had been on the books since the 50s that prohibited the firing of a handgun in a public park. So there are the targeting of individual elected officials, which is something we really have never seen, and then the penalties to cities, mainly in the form of cutting off funds. We're also seeing blanket preemption, which is this effort to totally this is primarily around business regulation, but to really get cities out of the business of regulating business altogether. So we've seen these broad sweeping bills that do two things. One of them, they either end a number of very specific policies. We've seen this in Michigan and Wisconsin, where a number of wage and benefit bills were eliminated in all in one bill, or we are seeing an effort, as we saw last session or earlier this year in Florida and Texas, to just eliminate local regulation out of business regulation. This comes with licensing, with standard setting, a whole realm of things. And then finally, what I just described was also the Death Star approach, when many policies were undone all at once. Next. So finally, the tide may be turning. I mean, after 9 years of sort of this very much of an erosion, a chipping away of local power and autonomy, session by session, issue by issue, this session in 2019, we saw some things we haven't seen before. And I think that there has been a sort of woke moment from elected officials, from city attorneys, from founders, from advocacy groups, saying, wait, we can't move our agenda here unless we start figuring out a way to push back, which is one of the reasons the Local Solutions Support Center exists. So what we've seen is this session, a record number of preemption repeal bills were filed. We saw 13 states had repeal bills on minimum wage. Colorado became the first state to legislatively pass a repeal of a minimum wage preemption. We also saw Arkansas repeal the broadband preemption in its state, most aspects of it. We see that more grassroots groups are working together cross-issue to really object and strenuously and vocally to this erosion of local power, coming together in ways that transcend individual agendas and really making the point that we are losing the ability of a whole level of government to function. We're seeing the emergence of more champions. I mean, I would name Pittsburgh Mayor Perduto has been particularly effective in arguing that he needs the ability to pass stronger gun laws than he can do right now under Pennsylvania's gun preemption law, particularly in the wake of the synagogue shooting there. We've seen this happen often. Also, Governor Evers from Wisconsin has made this a policy and budget priority for his administration. And then we're starting to see some more favorable rulings out of the courts. I am warned not to consider this a trend, but frankly, we have seen some very good rulings out of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida recently that may say that courts are starting to pay attention to where some overreach has occurred. Next. So I'm going to turn it over to Nestor here.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you all for joining us for this. I'm going to take Kim's national landscape and drill down a little bit in some of the issues that play out with preemption housing and particularly equitable housing policies at the local level. And I don't need to tell anyone on this call about the evidence between the link between health and housing. And obviously there's critical work to be done and to be funded around issues such as lead paint and indoor air quality, among many others. But as you know, the evidence on the link between housing and health implicates not just housing quality, but also housing location, given our deep history and really the ongoing reality of segregation in so many communities and inequality in access to opportunity, all of which deeply impacts health outcomes. And there is now, to pick up on Kim's landscaping about the tide possibly turning nationwide, incredible energy bubbling up at the local level to tackle inequitable patterns of housing and housing affordability. much of this energy, and we're going to, I think, continue to see more of it in years to come, and in the run-up to the 2020 election, where housing has been part of the conversation in a way that I don't think we've seen in many, many years. But much of the energy is focused around issues such as rent regulation and tenant protection and inclusionary housing. But it's also playing out at the local level around areas such as the rising challenge of the impact of short-term rental companies like Airbnb on housing affordability, and the ability of local governments to protect individuals against source of income anti-discrimination. And so I think it's possible to look, and if we could look at the next slide, please. It's possible to take a national scoping and add up a variety of local housing policies that try to advance equity, that try to advance inclusion, and that really are very much at the heart of a conversation about housing and health, and see in the area of housing, as Kim teed up for so many other areas of policy, where a steady accumulation of state preemptive laws has really constrained the ability of local governments to advance these policies. Next slide. So, for example, 2 states, Indiana and Texas, preempt the ability of local governments to pass source of income anti-discrimination provisions. That means that if you're a low-income resident with a Section 8 voucher or other forms of support, and a landlord discriminates against you, that's not currently covered by national fair housing law, but some states and increasingly local governments are very interested in protecting people in this way, and states are beginning, and unfortunately these trend lines tend to pick up, are beginning to prevent local governments from doing this. Next slide. As I mentioned, many communities, whether in rural New Hampshire or cities like Phoenix or here in New York, are really feeling the pinch when you get short-term rental companies at a large scale taking units off the market, and that really makes it very difficult to advance affordable housing and protect affordable housing. And local governments are trying to figure out ways to balance entrepreneurship and the ability to use these properties as owners want, with the effect on affordable housing. Unfortunately, that kind of local targeting and experimentation is being cut in too many states. 8 states now currently preempt, in part or entirely, local regulation around short-term rentals. Next slide. 10 states, actually, Florida, since we put this slide together, I realize we have to update it, just recently also took action here, but now 10 states, again, either in limited ways or in some states much more broadly, limit the ability of local governments to use their zoning power to advance equity through inclusionary zoning and other inclusionary housing programs. Next slide. And as Kim mentioned, this is probably the area where preemption has been most widespread in housing. A pretty broad swath of the country states have preempted rent regulation, tenant protections of various sorts. And I have to say, as I mentioned, that in terms of local desire, local action to free up the ability of local governments to innovate and experiment, so much of that energy really is focused on the ability to think about the regulation of the rental market in various ways. And this has been a long-standing area of preemption, and it has effectively limited rent regulation and certain aspects of tenant protection to a small handful of states like New York, New Jersey, California, Maryland. Next slide. So to bring that back, you can aggregate all of these and see a really national landscape where there are many, many states in various aspects of housing policy that have an impact on affordability, on inclusion. States are constraining, as part of this wave of new preemption and even before, the ability of local governments to act. And I'm sure you all know the context of healthy homes and where there have been a few preemption battles. I have followed a little bit what's happened in Toledo in the state of Ohio I'd love to hear more from folks who've been much more closely involved in that. But again, to take this national map, there are so many issues that impact that link between health and housing. And so many of those issues are being fought out in the larger preemption context that Kim laid out. And I think it is important to see those patterns. Next slide. So finally, for folks involved in housing policy, and especially for folks who think about the link between housing and preemption and that allocation of authority within states, it's, I think, important to acknowledge that, as Kim mentioned at the beginning, preemption is just a tool. It's just a way of thinking about the allocation of authority, and there's, in so many areas, much to recommend local action. There's much to recommend experimentation and innovation at the local level. But it's empowering local governments, particularly in the housing area, is something that can have a double-edged sword, as this slide points out. And I've spent a good part of my career in housing policy. As Rebecca mentioned, she and I overlapped at HUD in the 90s when I was there in the Office of General Counsel. And if you spend time in housing, of course, you're deeply aware of the history of exclusionary zoning, that picture on the left, and the use of local power for exclusion in ways that contribute to segregation and patterns of inequality. That picture on the right is from a recent New York Times story about single-family housing. That's I should have labeled it. That's a picture from the Times of Portland, Oregon, and the kind of pinkish purplish areas on that map are single-family housing zones, and 77% of the city of Portland is zoned solely for single-family housing, which obviously has a deep impact on questions of equity and inclusion, and then on health, because they're so closely related. And actually, these kinds of patterns have led the state of Oregon now to, in many ways, effectively bar single-family only zones, and other places around the country are looking at that. And that, of course, when a state-level government does that, that is preemption. And I think many people would agree that there are some things to commend in opening up more space for multifamily housing in some areas, even if that has to be done with sensitivity to context. So just to say that any effort to free local governments from state constraints to do more to advance health and welfare has to be undertaken, particularly in the housing context, with some care and some sensitivity to this double-edged sword issue. And I think there are ways to balance those things and to think about other, perhaps more targeted ways of getting at local misuse of authority at the same time that we recognize that there's a really great advantage to being able to innovate at the local level. So that's the landscape of housing preemption, and I think it does tie so closely to that larger landscape that Kim mentioned. And appreciate the opportunity to share that with you, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much. Final slide.
Thank you, Nestor, and thank you, Kim. This is incredibly sobering, and I guess my first question is for probably Kim. I'm curious, maybe, Sarah, if you could toggle back to the slide that has the list of all of the laws, the topical areas that are being affected by preemption. I just had a reaction when I looked at it, which is that you just can see the special interests. Maybe one more. I think it was the slide before this. Yes. When you look at this, you just see the special interests dripping all over this slide. And so I have a couple of questions on this. One is, what are some strategies for keeping those special interests at bay? I'm sure they're not unique to preemption. It's a larger issue of governance. But what strategies are folks finding effective? And then related, how are coalitions that care about these issues that we see on the slide here coming together to work on the issue of preemption? And I think that probably comes back also to your own organization, the Local Solutions Support Center. So Kim, do you want to tackle those two questions? What do we do about special interests generally speaking? And then how are coalitions that care about maybe more narrow issues coming together to work together on this broader issue of preemption?
Sure. So let me start with the corporate question first, because I think that folks understand or should understand that this is a very deliberate strategy on the part of corporations and their lobbyists to advance an agenda that reduces the amount of regulation they have to accommodate. And so rather than fight this out on the 19,000 cities that are recognized by the National League of Cities, they'd rather do it in 50 state capitals. So there's efficiency here. It is also where they have the most influence, given what they, in terms of their relationships and their contributions to campaigns. But end of the day, this is very much driven in many cases preemption by industry. So we're seeing obviously the telecom industry around broadband and 5G. The plastics industry is being, is everywhere. I mean, as they see efforts to ban plastic bags, plastic straws, single-use containers like styrofoam takeout containers, they are becoming more aggressive. We've seen a huge increase in the amount of e-cigarette, particularly by Juul Labs lobbying. Juul Labs alone increased its lobbying presence in state capitals 300% in the last two sessions. And so this is, again, the American Beverage Association around soda taxes. The way that we have tried to fight back with some success and some not success is really looking at the idea that, frankly, sunlight is the best disinfectant. One of the things we've learned early on as a hub is that inside of states and inside of cities, people feel like this is their own battle and their own fight, and they don't understand that this is really a national effort driven like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where industry has worked with conservative lobbyists and legislators to really write model bills that are then introduced in multiple legislatures at the same time, and to let folks connect those dots back to the industry, and let them know that that is actually the force behind a policy that would directly affect their income, their benefits, the health of their neighborhood, the quality of housing they can access. So letting people know that this is a national effort, nationally funded, nationally driven agenda has been very helpful. Again, because people are siloed and issues are siloed. I mean, one of the other things, to go to your second question, is really helping folks know. I mean, we work hand in glove with the Heart Association, with the Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, with Tobacco Free Kids and other health groups, because frankly, what we were recognizing is that they were being sort of limited by exactly the same kind of preemption efforts as folks who were trying to pass a minimum wage or paid sick time or a fracking ban. And the idea that they were all being affected by the same strategy, often introduced by the same lawmakers, and did not know it, was kind of stunning under the same dome in state capitals. And so what we've done is create and support financially and with other resources, the formation of cross-issue coalitions where the issue, is about the erosion of local power. Whether or not you want the minimum wage increased, the idea that localities should get to decide for themselves trumps everything else and transcends the individual agenda. Who decides here? So groups like the Equality Federation, the Sierra Club, I'm trying to think through. So we have worked with cross-issue groups and helped form them in Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Arizona, and and the members of those groups, again, cross that broad scope of, when you looked at the earlier, the next slide in this PowerPoint. So, I mean, folks who are fighting 5G preemption, plastic preemption, are also hanging together with people who are worried about environmental preemption, inclusionary housing preemption, and their collective power has actually been, we were able to see it. We've only been around for 2 years, and so we were able to see its effect more clearly this session than last session. And frankly, it put lawmakers back on their heels. Like, why are all these uncommon bedfellows together here? And, and how do we get around them? So that's our answer.
That's great. And I mean, I guess maybe that's one silver lining, is that you're getting all of these cross-sector conversations and collaborations to happen that hopefully will build capacity and power for future battles. So kudos to you for that. I have a question for Nestor, and I'm going back in my memory stores to my constitutional law classes and coming up dry here, but I'm trying to remember what are the protections that we have constitutionally, if at all, to keep states from taking these kinds of actions against localities? What constitutional rights do locales have that would protect them from this kind of infringement?
So we have 2 more hours for the webinar? No, I'm kidding. The short answer, the simple answer is that this is mostly not, but let me say mostly, a question of federal constitutional law. These issues are really mostly questions of state constitutional law, which is to say that states, and it varies significantly from state to state, have very different rules around what's called home rule. Some states don't have any formal home rule in their constitution at all, like Virginia and Vermont and places like that. Some states have very strong home rule, and cities can assert the argument that a particular infringement on local authority violates state constitutional law. But in most states, the state legislature has a lot of discretion, even within a relatively strong form of home rule, to limit local authority. And one of the things I think we need to do, and Kim and I are involved in a project where we're working on this, is actually stop responding to a lot of these things. Inevitably, you're going to have to respond, and cities are fighting, and advocates who have had success at the local level are fighting, and there's litigation across the country on many of these issues. And I think those challenges are important. But I also think it's important to open up a conversation about constitutional change, and here I mean state constitutional change, in the long run in a more affirmative way, in a way of thinking about what should home rule, what should that balance between the local and the state look like in the 21st century, in a moment when cities and metropolitan regions are driving the national economy, at a moment when, if you want to look at what the future of the United States will look like demographically in terms of the patterns of how we're going to live, look at cities today. The country will look in 50 years the way cities look today. And cities are where policy innovation increasingly is happening. And so I think we can have an affirmative vision that says that cities should have the authority they need to innovate in policy. They should have some, it can't be absolute protection. Preemption is important in some areas, as Kim mentioned, but it should be a higher burden on states before they displace local authority. And we should certainly make sure that cities have the resources they need to act, and we should make sure that local democracy, as Kim mentioned, gets some extra protection, so that no city council member should face personal liability just for attempting to legislate. You can agree, disagree with a given policy area, but I think we can all agree that if you've been elected by your citizens to represent you, you shouldn't be facing individual fines. And actually, in some states, in the firearm context, there's potential criminal liability, which I think everyone can agree should really not be a part of the state-local government relationship. So I teach state and local government law. I say to my students on the first day of class, this is actually a con law class. It's a con law class that doesn't happen to do much with the federal Constitution. But I do think there really is scope, both for some acts of defense, but really for law reform in this area. I'll just drop one more footnote, which is that there are some of these cases that do involve federal constitutional issues. So, for example, in fights between cities like Charlottesville, Virginia, and the state of Virginia over legislation that bars cities from removing Civil War monuments, even in majority African American cities where those monuments are deeply troubling for the people of those cities. Cities are asserting First Amendment claims. Birmingham, Alabama, passed a minimum wage law. Majority African American city, an all-white coalition of state legislators immediately preempted it, and that is now being litigated out through the federal courts on an equal protection challenge. It hasn't been fully resolved, and the decisions have gone back and forth at the trial level and at the Court of Appeals. But there is a claim being made, a strong claim being made, that aspect of preemption violates the Equal Protection Clause. So I don't want to say it's all just state constitutional law. Some of these do implicate important federal constitutional rights, but I think the heart of the question really has to do with how we think about how state constitutional law structures this local-state relationship.
I think it's really interesting, this idea of putting some boundaries around or guideposts around how preemption is used, because that last slide you showed was really interesting about how sometimes preemption works in our favor and sometimes it doesn't, and it's hard to say, yeah, we want preemption, but only for these things that, you know, go with our policy agenda, and we don't want it in these cases where we disagree. So setting some more neutral boundaries around it to make sure that at least there's good, thorough vetting of preemption policies and that citizens are involved and so forth. Just a basic governance practices is, I think, great strategy.
Absolutely.
One more question for Kim before we open up to the audience questions. Preemption is just kind of a technical issue, and you know, just not maybe something that comes up over the dinner table a lot. How do you communicate about it effectively? What have you found to be the most effective messages? Certainly, this webinar to me it really illuminates what the issues are and the threat. But as you're talking to legislators about it that have lots of different hot topics in front of them, how do you lay this out for them?
Well, I think that's kind of two different questions. I mean, one of them is that we definitely understand that preemption as a term and as a concept is not the sexiest thing on the planet. And so we have done extensive research and message testing to figure out how do we explain what's going on? How do we make folks understand that they should have a stake in this conversation? And so what we've learned is, you know, in a nutshell, if we describe it as state interference or state intervention in local lawmaking and local decision making, that is a way that people get it. Like, why should the state care whether I have a plastic bag ban in my city, you know, or the kind of bags that are available at my neighborhood grocery store on the corner, you know? So helping people understand that these are decisions that cities have traditionally made or have the authority to make or should be making, given their role in the economy and their challenge and mission to reflect their the needs of and views and values of their constituents. You know, they should have the authority to do this free from interference from the state. The other way that we have talked about this is, you know, we've learned that local control, as Nestor said, and per the last conversation, can be a dual-edged sword. I mean, we're really talking about an abuse of preemption. You know, it's the use of a tool that has legitimate purposes, and it's being misused or abused right now in ways that benefit corporations and frankly hurt communities, and helping people understand where that balance is. And then finally, really where we give folks a stake in this conversation is when we are able to show them the consequences or effects of preemption. So it isn't so much that this is a arcane tug of war, you know, intergovernmental relationship. You know, it really means there is no way in the state of Alabama right now that you can raise the minimum wage. The state won't do it. They're not allowing cities to do it, and they are at $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage. And so letting people know there is no remedy, there is no recourse here because this action has been taken. And it's not just about minimum wage, but it's really looking at, you know, you all are concerned about housing and access to, you know, what we saw in Miami, which just this year passed an inclusionary zoning requirement that was immediately preempted. I mean, and Miami has some serious housing challenges. They now have one less tool with which to attack that problem and to help the people of Miami. And so helping folks understand the consequences, not on the balance of power between cities and states, but really about what the quality of life is for the people of a city or a county, is the best way to make this argument and have this conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Kim. So I think we should open up to some audience questions, and I'll encourage folks, if you haven't submitted a question and have one, please feel free to do so. Let's start with a question about UCSF, sorry, hang on a minute. USSF. USFS, I'll get the acronym. Could you please address these issues? Preemption, which is that which takes authority for the USFS lands that surrounds many communities in the U.S. There's an effort to exclude the public from oversight, comments, and transparency regarding this land. The result is a continuation of control and bias in favor of what may be termed the extraction faction, or those who use the forest lands for profit. Nestor or Kim, either one of you want to comment on what you know about preemption as it relates to USFS lands?
I'll just say a word, and Kim has spent many, many years working on environmental issues, so I'm sure she'll have more to say. But I'll just say that this raises an important point, which is that we're very focused on preemption, as it pertains to really conflicts often between cities and states, or counties and states, local governments and states. But it is important, and Kim alluded to this in her first slide. Preemption is something that affects every level of government. And there are actually many issues in the housing space in particular, but in others, where federal preemption affects the state, federal preemption affects cities. Cities sometimes invoke federal authority in conflicts with the states. That's coming up, for example, in the sanctuary city context, and variations on that. And so, we're particularly focused on one slice of this, but the whole question of which level of government decides which kinds of issues, plays out at all three levels. And I think in its best iteration, it plays out in a cooperative way. And so, planning around Forest Service lands, if I have the context correct, I think, I lived in Colorado for many years, in places where the federal government in particular controls a lot of land, makes decisions. My sense is, that should be a cooperative exercise. It should be one that brings to bear in the planning process, local voices. Ultimately, it's up to the national government to set rules for national forests, for national parks, for wilderness land. But when that is done well, it is done as a reflection of the impact on local communities. And again, to come back to home rule for just a second, and then we'll see what you have to add here. But I think the right way to think about the relationship, particularly between cities and states, and it's very similar, is it should be cooperative. And in some states, in many areas, it is. And ultimately, who is the technically final decision maker should be less important than how local officials and state officials work together to get to the right outcome. And I think it's important to have that more positive vision. Kim, I don't know if you have anything else to add on USFS stuff.
Not specifically, even though I was with or helped a consultant at the Sierra Club for 13 years. I am very familiar with what the process has been and should be on paper. But I would say that what we are seeing in terms of denying the voice of people who once had a stake in the conversation and a role to play in the conversation is very consistent with what we're seeing across all of these issues and all of these realms. Let's face it, we look at this as very much a disruption of democratic norms and a very deliberate strategy to deny the voices of some people and the number of stakeholders in the deliberations and deciding outcomes. So for us, we look at preemption, whether it's around the Forest Service lands or around fracking, is really looking at it's part of what we see in gerrymandering or voter suppression, and that is limiting who speaks, who's accountable, and really looking at who the government works for. As I said earlier, it is about, who benefits, which is the corporations, or in your case, I love the phrase extraction faction, and who pays the cost, or who doesn't have a say anymore in this process. That is very consistent with what we're seeing across all of these realms.
And so this next question is maybe a different form of preemption. So this is about housing first. Regarding housing first, rapid rehousing, the HARF Act requirement of moving homeless individuals directly into subsidized housing, particularly in high-cost housing areas, is not working to increase income to a level that would allow the rehoused to afford the housing once the subsidy ends. And then it says local governments have little to no control over the Hearth Act mandates and funding that comes with it. And to reject Hearth Act requirements equals elimination of needed funding. There's not a question embedded here, but I think it's open for any comment that you might want to offer, Kim or Nestor.
Yeah, look, I think it's an important and challenging issue. As the federal government is retreating from, the level of subsidy we once saw, it's never been fully adequate, but it has gotten more and more restrictive. And, I live in New York City, and watching what's happening here with our, homelessness crisis and with the New York City Housing Authority, I think there are significant consequences for local governance when the federal government retreats. I do think it's something that I'm glad it is becoming part of the national conversation running into 2020. As I said before, it really hasn't been for many years, and I hope to see some positive movement here.
Mm-hmm. This is I think a softball here. Do either of your organizations have either Facebook sites or LinkedIn sites or Twitter accounts that could be used to share out and raise awareness of the issue on the effects of preemption? Maybe what we can do is just have you send that information to Sarah, and she can send it out through the chat here. Or if you have an easily rememberable website for people to go to that we can link to.
Sure. I'll just say not much on social media. I would be guilty. But we do have a website, supportdemocracy.org.
That is memorable. And Nestor, how about you? For folks wanting to connect with what Fordham's doing on this, what's the best way for them to learn more and share out?
Sure. Although I have to admit at my advanced age, I'm not the one who runs our Twitter feed. We do have one. We have something called the Urban Law Center, and it's a research center, so it's a little bit less advocacy focused and a little bit more research focused, although obviously those two things are connected. But I think the best thing to do, because I am blanking on our URL, is just to Google Fordham Urban Law Center, and it'll come up, and you can certainly find me on the Fordham faculty webpage. Happy to follow up with anyone who has further questions.
Thanks for that. Another question here, which I don't know that it has to do with preemption per se, but it relates back to how do we use sunlight as the best disinfectant, which I love that, and I think our healthy housing colleagues on the phone probably do too for a number of reasons. This commenter says that citizen information has been impaired in North Carolina by allowing agencies to publish regulatory information only on their websites instead of the previous requirements to publish in local papers, which potentially has equity implications. So what can be done to make public notice available to the public again? Any thoughts on this as one of the tools for maybe bringing sunlight to this issue?
Wow. Well, I will say, what we have done, to go to the earlier question about social media. I mean, one of the nice things about having these cross-issue coalitions is they have networks, they have communication systems, they have Facebook feeds, they have Twitter feeds. And frankly, that is, just person to person and relationship to relationship, how folks are, getting the word out about hearings, about meetings. When you can't go wholesale, you go retail, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. This does seem to be a common movement.
No, please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Nestor. I was just going to say in my own county where oftentimes I'm trying to follow what's going on with planning and zoning decisions, I do find that a lot of it is happening electronically. And my neighbors, some of the residents who are older and don't typically use the web as much or not on social, feel a little excluded and also just have a hard time accessing information. So maybe there's just a broader movement afoot nationally to kind of move these things electronic, and it's potentially a result of not being fully in touch with the constituents and the residents, which is also a larger issue.
Absolutely. And I'll just add quickly on that. One of the things that I think is really important, the work that Kim and I are doing around preemption, we've picked one particular flashpoint legally, constitutionally, structurally, in terms of organizing and the effect on communities. But it's also important to connect it to larger trends, whether that's concerns about transparency, which plays out in rulemaking. It also plays out in lawmaking. It's interesting, one area of state constitutional law that has gotten some traction is there are these old 19th century state constitutional provisions that say you can't put multiple topics in one bill. They're called SingleSubject Rules. And they were really a concern back in the 19th century with corruption, with log rolling. And in some areas of preemption, we see language preempting local authority getting snuck into bills that have nothing to do with the issue that's being preempted in the middle of the night at the last minute in a budget bill. And there have been some cases. There was one in Missouri about St. Louis's minimum wage law, where advocates and cities have been able to get laws, state laws, struck down because of this middle of the night adding on to other legislation that violates single subject rules. So whether it's gerrymandering, which can cause patterns of voting and legislative control that exacerbate conflicts between states and local governments, the influence, to go back to the question about interest groups, the influence of money at the state level, transparency concerns. I think it's really important to bring the conversation we're having today back to some of these really, really important structural questions that are playing out, and they are really all related.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Well, I think that concludes the questions that we have today. I want to thank both Kim and Nestor for this really extraordinary presentation and the important work that you're doing. I think that members of the National Safe and Healthy Housing Coalition will find this very useful, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you to think about ways that they can organize both nationally and also through all the communities that they're working with to make sure that preemption doesn't undo all the good work that they've been doing over the last couple of decades. Thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend, and you'll see everyone here, just the website for the Local Solutions Support Center. You can find Kim's contact information there and bios for the team. So please feel free to be in touch. And I'll hand back to Sarah just to close this down for today. So thanks again, Kim and Nestor, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This webinar was recorded, so we'll be sending the recording out and making that available online after the fact if you wanted to go back and revisit any of it or share it with anyone else. And yeah, again, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to our presenters for a really interesting and informative presentation. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.